Almost a year ago, one of my favorite YouTubers, Hazel, dropped a video about cozy anime RPGs, and it's been something that's kind of been kicking around in the back of my brain. Though I was alive for the big anime boom of the early 90s, we never had cable growing up, so most of my exposure to anime was really limited to what we got on broadcast TV, mostly being Digimon, Pokemon, and a little bit of that Monster Rancher show that nobody wants to talk about and everyone seems to have all collectively forgotten. In fact, the major way that I experienced anime as a kid was mostly through video games and JRPGs at that. But for all of the incorporation of anime styling, plot, tropes, and characters, one of the things that I've noticed is very few games seem to capture the episodic nature of watching an anime, opting instead to focus on a long-running narrative, much more akin to watching a feature-length film. Though episodic releases are fairly common now, with a big uptick in them around the time that Telltale-style adventure games started coming out, and even things like Alan Wake and Deadly Premonition intentionally aping the styles of murder and investigation TV shows, finding something that fits the same narrative framework is hard to find. Sure, you have things like old FPS games having levels broken down into chapters or packs, or expansions being released for PC games. The closest thing, to my mind, in a similar narrative fashion in the West is the way that RTS games handle storytelling, that being each level being a discrete story section that are bookended by small cutscenes or narration, but even this doesn't really capture that episode of anime feel. In Japan, of course, there was the game Live a Live, but an official release of that game would never hit American shores until 2022. P.S. I also did a video on Live a Live. You should check it out. It's pretty good. Which I suppose brings us to the topic of this video: the adventures of Horai High, exchange student drama bomb. There are a couple of different things that drew me to this game initially, but the big one that really sticks out to me is its modern setting. See, for a long time, and honestly still, it's much more common to see fantasy and sci-fi settings for video games, especially for JRPGs. There are notable exceptions, like the Mother series and the Shin Megami Tensei games, but those are notable simply because they are the exception. The whole game takes place on a Japanese island that's almost been wholly converted into a high school campus. Horai High is a bit of a weird school where student government bodies control the school instead of any sort of adults. There is a president and a vice president, and there are adult teachers, but they don't really have any influence on the way that the school is run. Right from the jump, this game is not shy about the fact that it will be dealing almost exclusively in anime nonsense, and I mean that in the most loving way possible. From the intro, where you are unceremoniously kicked out of the plane with a parachute to get to the opening ceremonies on time, to being recruited to a local school paper, which turns out to be an investigation club, to the appearance of a student club called the Midnight Penguins, who dress up in penguin costumes and pull pranks on the rest of the student body. If that doesn't sound fun at all to you, then I don't really know that there's much for you here. And another thing that you will notice after the first few hours of gameplay is this game does actually play like an anime. Once you get past the tutorial section, it quickly falls into a cozy rhythm of opening with an episode title and establishing sequence where you and your fellow Hotspo members meet to discuss a mysterious thing that's happening in your school and how you go about investigating it. And like the structure of a season of anime is all there too. There are Monster of the Week episodes that build towards an overall narrative. There's even like a mid-season fake-out villain that ends up joining your party. Hell, it even has what you may consider filler. We'll get to that later. One of the things that Hazel touches on in her video is that wintertime for her feels like cozy JRPG time, and while I don't really have that same association, playing through this game I definitely start to feel that vibe. In some small way, it conjures the idea of sitting by a fireplace and snuggling up in blankets, drinking a cup of cocoa, and sitting down in front of your Super Nintendo. The school and surrounding islands make for a fun and interesting setting with a surprising amount of variety. Each campus has different buildings and locations that open up as you progress in the game, and even optional fast travel in the form of a trolley system that can be upgraded as you visit new locations around the map. The school setting also provides a backdrop for one of the more interesting elements of this game, which is a job system. That's right, following in the footsteps of Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest before it, this game also features a job class system in the form of extracurricular clubs. Because if there's one thing I've learned from absorbing Japanese media about high school, it's that clubs are really important. Here, the clubs are organized into social, sports, and culture clubs, each having 3 different tiers that are unlocked after gaining experience, and generally unlocking either active or passive abilities. Though you can switch clubs freely at any time that you are in the club center, you will only retain the abilities that you learned if you put work in to master them. Also, apparently, according to NPC dialogues that I found, there are job synergies that afford special abilities if you're part of 2 specific clubs at the same time. I honestly never really noticed it. While some club progression is gated by level gains, you move through the club levels pretty quickly and also gain levels at a fairly quick clip, so you always want to be returning to the club center at least once per episode, if not more. And speaking of interesting proto-systems, if this game was made in a modern time, it would be really easy to make the mistake of calling it a Persona knockoff, or at least from Persona 3 onwards, the first 3, I suppose, if you really want to count the fact that Persona 2 is actually broken up into 2 separate games, is where the life sim stuff was really added into the series. This game also follows a similar format. See, the main character, much like the Persona MCs, is a super cool, charismatic person who naturally attracts friends despite never having spoken a single line of dialogue in the game. So, one of the currencies that you can spend after completing battles is leveling up your friendship with other characters. Each has their own unique friendship ability that increases in power as you level up your friendships. I have to tip my hat especially to the fan translation too. This one comes to us from the folks over at Aeon Genesis, which is a fairly well-established fan translation group. It's hard to really explain without actually playing the game yourself, but I feel like they've done a wonderful job catching the feeling of anime translations of the era without feeling like they're reaching too far for it, if that makes sense. It's explicitly a comedy game, and I know that sometimes there are issues translating comedies so it works from specifically other languages, but I think that they've done a really good job of translating it without just straight up adding American pop culture references. Looking at you, Working Designs. I'm joking, of course. I think those localizations have charm of their own. But the main takeaway here is that jokes are funny when they're supposed to be. I mean, even though it's basic, this game has freaking ending slides like a Fallout game, for Christ's sake. What's not to like? Oh, yeah, right. The filler. Listen, I know I've been spending this review basically heaping praise and generally gushing about how fun and cozy and interesting this game is, in which case I feel like it's only fair to give you the other half of it. Because for as much as I love this game and genuinely enjoyed my time with it, it is still an SNES era JRPG, and therefore falls into the traps of its genre. First and foremost, this game leans heavily on random encounters to pad out its playtime. In the beginning, the enemy encounters can be difficult or require strategy, but once you get your feet under you, it's basically just auto battle all the way home. and this combined with the high encounter rate really bogs the experience down. For as cool and interesting as the club system is, it feels largely unimportant to actually completing the game. Because the combat system is so basic and requires little engagement, it means that boss battles are really the only time that you're going to be manually picking commands. But even then, it's basic Final Fantasy boss rules. Buff your party, use your strongest attack skills. Status effects work sometime, but aren't really important, which just means that revisiting the club center from a mechanical standpoint becomes more of a chore that you do just because it feels bad to waste club XP. Which is really too bad, because in a better designed game, those complex interlocking systems really sing. Even in something less well executed of a job system like Final Fantasy V, acquiring new jobs and abilities and building your characters out into specific modes of play or roles is really a big draw for that game. And, unfortunately, looking for information with the game's developer, Dynamite turns up nothing, even on Moby Games, with just a passing mention to the company on its Giant Bomb page. So, likely this is a game that didn't sell well enough to warrant any sort of follow-up or other games. And it makes me a little bit sad to think about, because what there is here is interesting and intriguing, just maybe not handled by a skilled enough dev team to really make a cohesive experience. Ultimately, I think this falls into the category of interesting failures that by now you might see that I'm a little bit fascinated with, but overall I'm really impressed by this game. Issues with the combat system aside and the encounter rate, this clearly seems like it was a product that set out to capture a specific feeling and did so admirably. So much so that when I started playing the game, I was certain that there must be some sort of transmedia tie-in, an anime or a manga or something. So if you are interested in a competently crafted RPG that feels satisfying to play, I don't know, play a Final Fantasy game or something. But if you want something to hang out and vibe with and get cozy by the fire, then maybe check this guy out.